This is a training for the new indicator for the mental health, the CMH side of things for the state. It's indicator 2A. We're going to talk about first what was changed from the state's end. So we're going to go through highlights of the state's code book, and then talk about how the system was enhanced to meet the needs relevant to those changes. So first of all, what's included in this new indicator? Before, the state was only including cases where there was an intake. It was the time between the request and the intake, and they said only for cases where an intake occurred. But this ended up excluding a whole bunch of cases where there was a request and no follow-up. So in this indicator, the state is collecting all the data. They're going to be collecting data for every single request that comes in that was, quote, approved. And we'll talk about how we're defining that in a second. Another change is that there are no longer exclusions or exceptions. Before, the state gave us an opportunity to give good, legitimate reasons why it may have taken more than 14 days for an intake. We would gather all kinds of information about reschedules and cancellations to that end. We're still going to be gathering that information, but not for the purposes of excluding or accepting cases. The state wants to just get all the data and see where they are from there. The good news is there will be no benchmark for this first year. They're just going to gather the information and see where they want to go. Next, the state took a lot of time to explain carefully what the request date is defined as in these situations. So first, just the broad definition. The request date for this indicator is the first time we receive a phone or walk-in request for non-urgent services by the individual, their parent, their guardian, or from a referral. This is the same definition as before. But the state got a lot more careful on some edge cases. For example, missed calls. The state says the request starts as soon as the person provides their name and contact information. So for example, let's say a consumer calls on January 1st for the first time, and they leave a message with their name and callback info. But for whatever reason, they were not able to get a hold of Access, so they left a message. Let's say Access calls them back, but they're unable to reach them. And let's say the consumer calls back a couple weeks later on January 15th, and they request services, and they're scheduled for a face-to-face assessment. Although the data weren't entered until the 15th, when the data are entered, the request date is 1/1, the day that the person first provided their name and contact information. Here's another edge case, referrals. In the case of a referral, the request date is the day that the outside organization calls and makes that request on the consumer's behalf. We need to put a fine point on the fact that the consumer has to, or a guardian has to be aware and agree to the referral for the state to be considered a request. So for example, let's say provider A, the outside organization, calls on January 1st on behalf of the consumer. Access, using whatever local procedures, ensures that the consumer is aware of this referral and agrees to have their information taken. And then Access gathers that information to be able to look it up later if the consumer calls. Then let's say the consumer calls on January 15th to schedule their intake. Access, because they gathered all that information before, is able to look through the documentation and see that the call from provider A first happened on January 1st. The request date is 1/1. So again, although it wasn't entered until the 15th, the request date that's entered is 1/1. Let me just show what it looks like on the flip side of that. Suppose a provider calls Access on behalf of the consumer requesting services on January 1st, but the consumer is not aware of that referral. They don't know that this is happening. And then let's say the consumer calls Access themselves on January 15th. In this case, the request date is 1/15. because we didn't have an official request on 1/1. What makes it official? The consumer agreed and was aware. That didn't happen. So the request date in this case is 1/15. There is one special kind of referral where we change the request date to the discharge. So when the referral is coming from an institutional setting, like inpatient or jail or prison or something like that, in this case, even though the call may have come in while they were in that setting, we start the clock for 2A at the discharge or release date. And we'll talk more about that, how to do that in Cricket later in this training. One last little clarification that the state gave us is they really nailed down the difference between a new request and a continuation of a previous request. So let's say a person calls on 1/1, they schedule their intake, and then that intake is canceled, and then they call back on February 1st. The state is saying, since it's still within a 60-day window of that initial call, it's actually still a continuation of that request on 1/1. This is not new. And let's say they have an intake scheduled on February 3rd, and again, they don't show up. It's a no-show. If they call back again after that 60-day mark, which in this example would be on March 1st, then this is a new request. Although it's really, it's good for CMH Access to know what's going on behind the scenes here, most of the work for this indicator is going to be taken care of with Cricket. So Cricket is going to look through all the requests for service form whose disposition is access screening, and it will figure out which ones are new and which ones are going to be held back and not sent to the state. So even if there were a request for service here on 2/1, Cricket would know, oh, there was already one on 1/1. I won't send that one to the state. Some local procedures may tell you that you shouldn't actually enter the second one. So I want to make sure to say here, see local procedures on how often you're expected to enter your request for service forms. So those are highlights from the state. Now let's talk about changes that are going to be happening in Cricket to deal with the new structure of indicator 2A. This is just an overview right here. I'm going to go through each of these individually next. Changes on the request for service form. One thing that's going to be added is what's being requested. This will give you an easy way to get an understanding of that consumer's request pathway, I guess. If you look at it from the list screen, you can see they're requesting MI, they're requesting MI, they're requesting SUD, they're requesting both. Something that needs to be noted, although you won't really see it on the front end here so much, this is where we're going to be getting the request dates for the PI indicator. Whenever there's a request for service whose disposition is access screening, then that is a date that will be considered when Cricket is going through the algorithm to figure out what's the first request date. So this is a critical part of this process. The next step after request for service is a screening form. Because the request for service is so absolutely critical in this process, it is required before a screening form can be done. So the link to the access screening will now only be found in the most recent request for service form whose disposition is access screening. If there's no such request for service form within the last 60 days, then there will be no link to create the screening form in the first place. So in order to undo that, you'll have to enter the appropriate request for service form. I had said earlier that the state is collecting all, quote, approved requests. The way that we're going to know that a request has been approved is if there exists a screening form where they're authorized to CMH or SUD and it says actually full assessment needed, which means they're being referred on to CMH for an intake. So I want to make sure this is clear. We're not using the screening form for its date. We're using the screening form for its check of this box, yes or no, should we include this case in 2A? The dates come from the request for service form. And then another change on the screening form is presumed designation. Because we're including cases in this indicator before they actually, they may never get an intake, we need to know whether to put them in the MI or DD pool. So you would enter this presumed designation. If they end up getting an intake, then we would use the disability designations on their demographics. But if there is no intake, then we rely on this. The next step after screening forms is the biopsychosocial. Changes here. If a consumer is eligible for services, then you will not be able to get out of this form unless they have in their disability designations either MI equals yes or DD equals yes or both. Also, if you do choose both, there's going to be a selection here where you can say which one is primary. Is it DD or MI? So although I just covered pretty much everything, I want to go through them one by one and make sure it's abundantly clear how this works. So let's talk about changes for the request for service and how you might use this in some examples. I don't think I could say this enough. It is critical that Access enters a request for service form with disposition of access screening in order for Cricket to know the dates that requests are coming in. Also, there's this change where you can say what's being requested. You could choose one of these, you can choose all of them. Here's an example of how that might go down. Here's an example. 2 requests coming in before the screening. You could enter them both. Of course, check local procedures if you should do that, but you can. Suppose a consumer calls on 1-1 requesting MI adult services at the CMH. Access schedules them for a screening later that day, and the consumer no-shows that screening. And then they call again on 1-2. Depending on your local procedures, you could enter a second request for service form here. Cricket would be able to look through both of these forms and say, even though I see a request for service on 1-2, it's not the first one. The first one was on 1-1. That's the one we send to the state. That's the one we use for this indicator. So multiples are dealt with by Cricket. Here's another example of how to use the forms. In this case, it's about missed calls. So suppose a consumer's guardian calls for the first time on 3-2, leaves a message with their name and callback information, and they're requesting DD services. Let's suppose Access calls them back on 3-3 and schedules them for a screening. Although they did not know that the request was headed for an Access screening until 3-3, but when they do know this, and they enter the request for service form, the request date should be 3-2, because that's the day when the guardian left their name and callback information. Also notice this DD thing here. That's what I mean when I'm saying it makes it easier to navigate their request pathway. You can see what it was they were asking for right from the list screen. Here's another example. This is a request coming in while the consumer is in the hospital. This is a very special case, though, I need to say this, where the biopsychosocial is going to be done on the hospital floor. If you don't do biopsychosocials on the hospital floor before discharge, this wouldn't apply to you. So let's say the consumer's mother calls on 1-1 saying her teenage daughter is in the hospital. She wants to set her daughter up with services after she's discharged on 1-3. Access plans to do a screen that same day and then have someone from CMH go over and do a biopsychosocial with the daughter while she's still admitted, before she gets out. since the biopsychosocial is going to take place on the hospital floor, this should be treated the same as any other request. On the request for service form, the request date is 1/1, the day that they first got the name and callback information. Now let's talk about the special case. What happens if you're getting a referral from an institutional setting and you're not going to be doing the biopsychosocial in place? It will happen after release or discharge. So it says here, special case, starting the clock at discharge. The only time this needs to be done if the consumer is being referred from an inpatient stay, jail, or some other institutional setting. And it only applies if the biopsychosocial will be done after they're discharged. Here's an example of how it works. Let's say the consumer the request comes in when the consumer's in the hospital, just like above, but the BPS this time is scheduled after discharge. So the consumer's mom calls on 1/1. She wants to get her daughter set up with counseling after she's discharged on 1/3. Access does a phone screening and schedules a biopsychosocial for 1/4, the day after she's out. Because the biopsychosocial is going to happen after discharge, we need to find a way to let the indicator know that the clock should actually start on the discharge date. Here's how it goes in Cricut. So on the request for service form, if the referral source is one of the following, anything that could be used to indicate that the person's coming out of a hospital, or anything that could potentially be used to indicate that the person is coming out of jail or prison, whenever this happens, a new field is going to open up on the request for service form called the discharge/release date, down here. So you would still, on the request for service form, enter 1/1 as the call date, but what would be different is if they've been released or discharged and you want that to start the clock, then you would enter that date here. In this case, her discharge date was 1/3. So now when Cricut is running through all the request for service forms and their dates, if it sees this date, this is going to trump the 1/1. It'll see that the discharge was on 1/3 and use that to start the clock for this indicator. So that was the request for service form changes. Next, let's talk about the access screening form. Again, there has to be a request for service whose disposition is access screening in order for a screening form to be allowed. The way that this is being controlled is the link to create an access screening is going to be found on the last request for service whose disposition is access screening. If there's no such form, then there won't be a link, and the form will have to be entered in order to get that link. There are new disposition values in the screening form. You can actually make it so that the person is referred to CMH for an intake, or SUD for an intake, or both. If you select this here, full assessment needed, that's the trigger for this case to be included in indicator 2A. Not the date of the screening form, but this says, yes, include it. And then again, under the disposition, you put in the presumed designation. This will be used to determine if they're MI or DD when they don't actually end up getting their intake. And you could select both, by the way. Okay, lastly, biopsychosocial forms. Very simple changes here. First of all, as I said earlier, if the person is eligible on the disposition, then they either have to have MI equals yes or DD equals yes, or both, but you cannot leave the form unless one of those happens at least. And if both is selected, then another field is going to pop up to say which one is primary. So the last part of this training is to go through, these are actually real examples that are pulled from different CMHs. And And the question is, if they're not documented correctly, what should change and why? The questions are here, and the answers are on the last page. So please do go through these examples and make sure you understand why the answers are what they are. If you don't, please contact your liaison for this indicator. That would be in Lenawee, Wendy, in Monroe, Andrea, in Livingston, believe it would be Diane, and in Washtenaw, I think it would be Laura Heigl. Thank you so much.